Nós já iremos começar o próximo painel. Antes, para os brasileiros que estão aqui, eu queria fazer um breve comentário sobre o professor Klarman. Ele é o professor de Direito Constitucional mais popular aqui, né? Para a gente conseguir uma matéria com ele, a gente tem que colocar ele na primeira preferência, mesmo assim as listas de espera são enormes. Ele é uma enciclopédia, ele sabe tudo sobre direito constitucional, história americana, enfim. Foi muito bacana ter a oportunidade de ouvi-lo aqui um pouco sobre a história. Eu agora vou introduzir em inglês os nossos próximos participantes, e esse painel agora vai falar um pouco sobre os desafios institucionais em países emergentes. So, good morning, everyone. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to thank you for being here. I want to say that I'm very honored and thrilled to moderate the panel Institutional Challenges in Developing Countries, which is aimed at providing insights and tools to critically assess the quality of our institutions and think new ideas to better Brazil and other developing countries. Our distinguished panelists are Professor Horini Pande and Justice Luiz Roberto Barroso. I welcome you here. So first, we'll have Rohini Pande, who is a professor of international political economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She co-directs the Evidence for Policy Design initiative. She is an economist whose research examines the economic costs and benefits of informal and formal institutions in the developing world and the role of public policy in affecting change. Pande received a PhD in economics from London School of Economics, a master's from Oxford University, and BA in economics from Delhi University. Our next speaker will be Luiz Roberto Barroso, who serves as a justice in the Supreme Federal Court of Brazil and is one of the leading constitutional judges of our time. Barroso is a professor of constitutional law at the Rio de Janeiro State University and one of Brazil's foremost constitutional scholars. Justice Barroso earned an LLM degree from Yale Law School, not Harvard, and a PhD and a master, and a PhD and a master's degree in law from the Rio de Janeiro State University. And I had the pleasure to clerk for Justice Barroso for almost 3 years in the Supreme Court. It's great to have you here. Professor Pande and Justice Barroso will make a 30-minute presentation each, and then we'll have around 15 minutes for audience Q&A. To make the panel debate more interesting, please submit your questions through the app Slido. You will also be able to vote for the questions you like the most. You can connect to the Harvard Public Wi-Fi and go to slido.com using the code Harvard Law Brazil. Thank you. We'll start with Professor Pande now.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I also feel quite intimidated since my knowledge of the legal field is very limited. I am an economist by training. I am at the Kennedy School, and I work on areas of public policy. So I thought I'd start by talking about actually the one case where my work has engaged and interacted with the judiciary. And I want to use that to open up for a broader discussion of the role of evidence in the judiciary, and in some sense pose a question to you as to why we see, at least in the countries where I work, less of an engagement of empirical researchers with members of the judiciary relative to, say, the bureaucracy or politicians. So let me start by describing something that then has turned out to be a continuing stream of work for me, which is I joined Kennedy School in 2006, and I think roughly a couple of years later, I was sitting in my office, and this lady entered my room, and she said, I am the legal representative for the environmental regulatory body in a state of India, Gujarat, which is one of the fastest growing states in India, also well known for being the state of our current Prime Minister. And she said, happened to be in Kennedy School, and I've heard that faculty here work on policy-related issues, and so here is what I've come to you with. So in India, as in many developing countries, there are quite strong environmental regulations on the books, but these are not enforced. So if you look at India, it basically copied the Clean Water and Air Act of the US, very stringent, so we have no civil penalties for pollution, but it's a criminal penalties for pollution. And if you go to any part of India, or even if you read the newspapers, you will hear about very high levels of air pollution. So the regulatory standards are typically never met. Now, enforcing this comes to the regulatory body, and one thing that the regulatory body felt was that they didn't have the staff to get good data through inspections on the levels of pollution. And this is, I think, quite a common problem in a number of countries where, partly due to public sector reforms, and in the case of India, IMF coming in the early 1990s, there was a freeze on public sector hiring. And so there was very few inspectors while India industrialized hugely. So the High Court in Gujarat, so that's the level below the Supreme Court, heard a case on high levels of air and water pollution in the state, and said that there's no reason for us to think of environmental capital as different from financial capital. So just as we require companies to provide audits of their financial records, I'm going to require that companies start providing audits of environmental records annually. And this, I would say, is quite a common practice. So even if you look in the US, how does the Environmental Protection Agency enforce pollution? It does to a large extent by self-reports. So you actually just submit audit reports. So the judiciary ordered this, and then the regulators started getting these audit reports. They were concerned that when they looked at these audit reports, there was not much information in it. So this, you can imagine, is a classic conflict of interest situation. I am being hired as an auditor by a firm. I want the same job next year. If I report that this firm has very high pollution, I'm not going to get this job the next year. And I think this is a problem we see not just in environmental arena, but often also in things like labor standards, that you have private audits and the auditors face a conflict of interest. You also see this in international verification cases. So for instance, when Nike wants to have standards on child labor in India or Indonesia, it's actually asking these companies very often to provide reports on how well they're being kept. So she said that the regulators stopped paying much attention to these reports because they felt there was no information in them. The industry got emboldened and went back to the court and said, you should end this scheme because they're not being used and it costs us a lot of money to provide these audit reports. So the court came back to the regulator and asked them, and the regulator described this problem. And then the court said, we want you to reform the system. And here's the important part. They said, we want you to provide scientific evidence that whatever reform you're going to undertake is actually going to lead to good information coming out. And so she had come to my office to say that we need to go back to the court with good scientific evidence that you can actually improve the quality of audits. And if not, we're going to have to disband audits. And so this, to me and to many of my colleagues, seemed like a very attractive opportunity to work with the regulator to try to understand what was going wrong, use what we can do, which is, in my case as an economist, some amount of economic theory, to understand how can we possibly align the incentives of the auditors in order to match those of the regulator rather than that of the firm. So we spent some amount of time in the field, and then we identified two possible things. First, we realized there was a lot of auditor shopping going on. So you were going to the marketplace, and you were looking across auditors, and auditors were bargaining. In economics, we call this Bertrand competition. You keep reducing the price, and in the end, you offer to do the audit at a price so low that you'll actually not do the lab tests, you'll just stick it. So the first thing we said is that you should not allow firms to choose their auditor, but rather have a set of verified auditors and just assign them. The second thing was to cut the financial link, which was to have the firms pay into a central pool and then have fixed rates at which they're being paid, not to be paid directly by firms. And then the last was to have some monitoring of the monitors. Now, this is the kind of thing you can do the economic theory, and you can come up with these insights, but it's not clear how much this is actually going to matter on the ground. Especially in countries like India that have weak institutions, I think you can start with a lot of pessimism that nothing will matter. This is just going to change the bribe rate, but it's actually not going to do anything on the ground. And again, I think this is where working between researchers and the regulator who was being pushed by the judiciary was valuable, because they agreed to run the equivalent of a clinical trial for 2 years. So think about how new medicines get ratified. They very often do these clinical trials where a random set of patients get the medicine and the rest get a placebo. And then you look to see whether those who get the medicine, their health improves. So in this case, we worked at scale in 2 districts across something like 400 industries. And in half of them, chosen by lottery, we expanded, we implemented this reform. And then after 2 years, we found significant evidence that this had led to improved reporting. And we knew it was improved reporting because we ran independent surveys to check this. The regulator then went back to the court with this evidence, and then this reform was rolled out across the state. So I think this is, as I said, this is the only time I have worked on a public policy project which was pushed by the judiciary. In the end, our engagement was with the state, but the reason why the state wanted to do this was because the judiciary asked them to do it. I work on political economy. A lot of the time I work on corruption reforms across South Asia, and we usually have a lot of cynicism among academics. So their view is, you can go and try some little reform. For instance, how do you reduce teacher absenteeism? How do you prevent doctors from charging too high a price? But in the end, once the researcher leaves, this is going to be something that will just fall apart, because the political economy of reform is such that no one is going to implement it. And I think that can often be true. It didn't turn out to be the case for us in the environmental case, because the judiciary stepped in. And in India, in general, on all environmental matters, the judiciary has been very proactive. So as a result of this, I have since been, for a couple of large environmental conferences with the judiciary. But what's interesting to me is a lot of the discussion on issues to do with environment, or say even with climate change negotiations, are about trying to understand legally what is feasible, and less attention is paid to what can happen in terms of implementation when you're thinking about in this ground with weak institutions. So I'm actually probably going to talk for less long than I was asked for, because I felt this was a unique opportunity to me to hear from you as well about why, and maybe it's different in Brazil, but why is it that we see less engagement of evidence-based policy making very often with the judiciary in terms of just data collecting or examining the role of reforms? I feel in the judiciary there is, data comes very easily. It's very common to have file briefs which are based on evidence. But the actual act of saying we should go out and collect evidence on reforms, often evidence that will take a couple of years to collect, is something that, at least in the countries that I have worked on, comes less from the judiciary. It could be that, this kind of proactive reform thinking is not something that the judiciary is going to be engaged in. It's going to pass judgments on issues that have come to hand. But I think the the fear is that unless there is some mechanism for actually reforms to be evaluated and tested, we will not know what will work and what will not work, especially in settings with weak institutions. I think one of the very well-known examples from Brazil that we all teach in our courses is, of course, the audits of municipal governments that take place. And there are a set of famous papers that examine what happened when audits were released just before Brazilian elections rather than just after, showing big effects of voters penalizing those. There's recently been some research also looking at what happens for those who have, say, just by randomly multiple audits during the same election term. And their argument is that to the extent it has a disciplining effect on politicians, it's because of the fear of legal sanctions. It's actually less because of electoral sanctions, but legal sanctions. Again, as I said, we teach this work, and we always talk about transparency initiatives based on the Brazilian experience. And again, I'd be curious to hear about, if you wanted to build on these reforms, how is the judiciary placed to actually collect evidence and work with researchers in this area? Let me stop there as a set of opening remarks, and I'm happy to come back more, but I wanted to have more of a dialogue than talk.
Thank you, Professor Pande. We will have a lot of questions for you, for sure. So I'll pass to Justice Barroso.
Dear Aline Osorio, dear Professor, my dear friends, it's a pleasure to be here and to share with you all some ideas and some reflections on institutional challenges in developing countries. That was quick.
And I said I'd rather have a dialogue than to talk at people.
I was still finishing up my notes here. It's a great pleasure for me to talk to Brazilian judges, and especially at trial court level judges. I think, I'm not a career judge, as you certainly know, but I think you've been doing a terrific job in Brazil and changing the judiciary and the country from the bottom to the top. And of course, this major role that judges are playing in Brazil right now do subject them to all sorts of attacks from an old order that would like to keep things as they have always been. But the first thing I want to say is keep up the good work. I think you are on the right side of history, and the country really needs you. And I think that you are the trustees of a lot of hope that the country has right now on the capacity of the judiciary to change habits that are so ingrained and that have naturalized wrong things that people don't even notice that they were there. The second thing I would like to say is there is a wave of negativity in Brazil right now that does affect the self-esteem of people. And I want to say I wasn't caught by this wave. I think we are in the process of changing paradigms, changing the country. I do think we have a great chance to refound the country on higher public and private ethics levels, and I think we should not miss this chance. So I'm very optimistic on how things are going. The problem is the picture of the current moment. I think I'm going to talk from there. I like to see people when I talk and make sure they're not going like this. I think the problem is with the picture of the moment we live in. We have a good history. The 30 years of Brazilian democracy have generated a good history, although the current picture is devastating. So I think a good sentence a good quote that would summarize what we're going through, we can find in Antonio Gramsci when he wrote, "The crisis," wrote Gramsci, "consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appears." So I think we are in the process of moving from the old to the new one. And the picture does reflect the morbid symptoms of the difficulties in this transition. But as I was saying, I think we are in the process of refounding the country. So I don't feel like the character of the story my good friend Carlos Aires likes to tell, that this guy went to the doctor, and the doctor tells him, "I have bad news for you. I have bad news, and I have even worse news for you." And he asks, "Well, tell me the bad ones first." And the doctor says, "You only have 24 hours of life." So, well, what could be worse than that? I've been meaning to tell you since yesterday. Well, I would like to start this talk on a positive note. The first positive note I would like to highlight here is that 30 years of life in any constitution in Latin America, the endurance of a constitution for that long, is an achievement that we should celebrate. So this is the first thing. And it has been a normative constitution in the sense that it has been a constitution that actually apprehends the political process and to a great extent has been able to domesticate the political process. So the first thing in institutional debate I would like to say is I don't think we should throw away the political capital that the Constitution represents. And I am totally against convening a new constitution in Brazil. I don't think it's time. I don't think it's convenient. And I think this constitution, which is not ideal, has, however, helped very successfully for Brazil to make the transition from an authoritarian regime to a democracy. And I would be very scared of what could come next if we would get rid of this constitution and restart this discussion. Whoever here lives in Brasilia, I think there is a good story that can illustrate what I think. I live by the lake in Brasilia, and a few months ago, a family of capybaras started living in my garden. It started with 4, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32. So they just keep multiplying, and I was scared about that. And you can't touch a capybara. It's an environmental crime, no bail, if you kill a capybara. So I asked my personal trainer, who lives in Brasilia, has been there forever, said, "What's the predator? Who is the predator of capybaras?" And he says, "Onça." So, you know, I started to think they were kind of good-looking and charming because, I mean, onça or tiger or jaguar, I don't know how to translate onça to English. So I would stick with what we know that, you know, won't be too harmful. And this Constitution, I think I should say, has helped us with 3 great achievements that we should celebrate. The first one is institutional stability. We've had 30 years of institutional stability. I know the younger ones won't give too much importance to this, but Brazil, in the worst Latin American tradition, has always been the country of the coup d'etat, of the overthrowing of governments, of breaches of constitutional legality. It's been like this forever, since the first moment when Peter I dissolved the first Constitutional Assembly, until the military coup of 1964. So 30 years of institutional stability. is an achievement that we should celebrate. And these have been no ordinary times. We've had difficulties and scandals like the Mensa loan, like the Petro loan, like the car wash operation. We've had the impeachment of 2 presidents that were elected by popular vote, and still no one ever so far cogitated of any solution that would not be the respect for the Constitution. So many of us who have seen the darkness of a dictatorship, we know how much we appreciate living under democratic institutions that are stable, like Brazilian ones have been. The second achievement that I think we should celebrate and still highlighting some positive aspects of these 30 years, and the point I'm trying to make is the snapshot of this moment is dramatic, but the movie of the Brazilian democracy, the 30-year movie of the Brazilian democracy, is a fairly good one. So the second achievement I would like to highlight here is monetary stability. Whoever is over 40 here, there are a few of us that are over 40 here, knows the horrors of hyperinflation and how terrible it was to live with all those failures, those economic plans that never worked, Cruzado 1, Cruzado 2, Bresser, Verão, Collor 1, Collor 2, and the dramatic situation that it was living under hyperinflation. Always noting that hyperinflation is very cruel to the poor, because whoever has money and capital, you can preserve it in financial markets. But if you are living on wages, you just see your money devaluate every day. So hyperinflation was one of the causes that aggravated this abyss of inequality that we still have in Brazil. And then in the mid-90s, we were finally able to tame inflation, and although it haunts us every once in a while, we do have a currency and monetary stability in Brazil, and that was an important change. And with monetary stability came fiscal responsibility. We are still learning this lesson, but one thing that is important in Brazil, and an idea that's catching up, is that fiscal responsibility has no ideology. It's not left-wing or right-wing. It's just a premise of the economy. And if you spend more than you collect, you either bring the rise of interest rate or you bring inflation. So fiscal irresponsibility is always harmful to the poor. And I think this is a lesson we are still learning, but it's a very important lesson. And it came with monetary stability, because inflation could kind of hide the mismanagement of budgets. And a third and last achievement I would like to highlight here, and I think we should celebrate, is social inclusion. Okay, the good thing that I'm talking from here is that I can see you. The bad thing is that I can't see my notes. But the third achievement is social inclusion. In 30 years of democracy, over 30 million, between 30 and 40 million people in Brazil left the line of extreme poverty. In these 30 years of democracy, Brazil had the fastest growing level of Human Development Index in Latin America and Caribbean. Brazilians live now over 11 years than they used to live 30 years ago, and the income increased by 55%. And in the goals of the millennium, the goal of the millennium was, before 2015, to get 50% off the line of extreme misery, and we had almost 70% of achievement. So social inclusion was also a point that in these 30 years of democracy, we can celebrate. I know that with the economic crisis of the past years, there have been problems, and around 4 million people fell back in poverty. But still, the balance is very favorable. So to end this first chapter, what I want to say is that in 30 years, we were, in one generation, 30 years of democracy, we were able to defeat the dictatorship, extreme poverty, and to promote very impressive social inclusion in Brazil. So there's no battle that is invincible, I think I should say. And I think we live in Brazil at this moment a fortunate and immense demand for integrity, for idealism, for patriotism. And I'm very convinced that this powerful energy is the energy that shifts paradigms and pushes history forward. That's the reason why I'm very optimistic about the things that are going on in Brazil. The other point, the positive point I would like to highlight briefly is that in these 30 years of democracy, we made a lot of progress in an area that we had felt behind, which is the protection of fundamental rights. And I just wrote down a quick list of achievements in this area of fundamental rights protections. Women's rights, probably no change is more visible in Brazil in the past 30 years than the changes in the recognition of women's rights and their role in the job market, protection against violence, and even sexual rights in a conservative country like Brazil has experienced important advancements in the anencephalic fetuses case decided by the Supreme Court, and even in the abortion case decided by the first panel. There have been progress in the protection of blacks in Brazil, Afro-Brazilians, with the affirmative actions being strongly supported by the courts, both for access to university and to public offices. The LGBT community in Brazil has found in the judiciary a strong protector of their rights. We now have in Brazil gay partnership, and we have civil marriage for gays, and that was unthinkable 30 years ago. So I think in life we should celebrate victories that we achieve. The indigenous peoples have encountered in the judiciary strong protection for the demarcation of their lands, and I think this is an important achievement. And one thing I want to highlight here that most urban people don't pay attention is whenever you demarcate indigenous people's lands, you are protecting the environment, because areas that have been demarcated, they don't suffer problems with the tearing down of the forest. So protecting the Indians is an important way of protecting the environment. We have important decisions involving transgenders, involving freedom of expression, animal ethics, which is a subject that's not yet in the radar of the mainstream in Brazil, but we have important decisions against cockfighting, against farra do boi, boar of the ox, but whatever, and vaquejada. So I think it's an enlightened role that courts play, bringing to the public debate this matter of animal ethics that is in the agenda of any progressive country at this moment. I don't want to say the Supreme Court always got it right. There are decisions that I would strongly oppose, like teaching religion in public schools. There was a decision of maintaining postal monopoly in the internet era. There was a decision that had very bad consequences when the cláusula de barreira, the barrier clause, the electoral threshold was struck down by the court and had as a side effect this multiplication of parties. But I think the balance of the Supreme Court and of the judiciary more generally in these 30 years of democracy is strongly and positive. So this is what I would like to say, the good things I would like to say about this period. There being some negative points too, and I would like to highlight two of them very briefly, looking back to these 30 years of democracy. The first one, it's impossible not to point this out, is the political system. When I say the political system, I'm talking about the system of government, presidential or parliamentary. I'm talking about the electoral system, proportional, majoritarian, or mixed. And I'm talking about the party system. We have problems with the three of them. I won't have the time to explore this here, but I do think Brazil desperately needs a political reform that can reduce the cost of elections, that can increase the representativeness of members of Congress, and that can facilitate governance. I'll give a very brief example of each of them. First, the problem of the cost. The election for the for the Chamber of Deputies, for example, it costs 5 to 10 times the amount that the deputy will be able to receive legitimately in 4 years of his mandate. So the problem of corruption in Brazil has one first cause, math. Because this gap between what it costs and how much you can make makes the representatives go seek for this difference somewhere else. And that's where the problem starts. Second, the problem with the lack of representativeness, which is a major problem also. The way the electoral system and the elections for the Chamber of Deputies is organized in Brazil is a proportional system with an open list. So the voter votes for whoever he wants, or he or she wants. That's a good thing. The problem is he votes for whoever he wants, but he elects someone that he doesn't know who he or she is, because his vote goes to the party, and every time the party fulfills the electoral quotient, it makes one representative. Less than 10% of the members of the House of Deputies are elected with their own personal vote. 90% of them are elected with the transfer of votes from the party. So at the end of the day, the voter doesn't know exactly who he elected, and the candidate doesn't know exactly by whom he was elected. So it's a system with no accountability. If any of you want to know how your representative positioned in regard to the pension system reform or the labor reform, you just can't do it. You don't know, because you don't know exactly who your vote sent there. So we do need to change the political system to make it more representative, definitely, to make it less expensive. I won't talk about the party system because I don't have the time, and it's too sad a story anyways. The second weak point that I think I need to stress here is the systemic corruption that we discovered, because it's been there for a long time. It's a cumulative process. It didn't start now. It didn't start last year. It didn't start 10 years ago. But it's a problem that kept growing. I'll be very brief in this chapter, and then I will conclude them, because we've been talking too much about corruption. But the reality is that the sense that this problem exists is fairly new in Brazil. What we finally realized is that corruption in Brazil was not caused by single individual failures. Unfortunately not. It was a systemic corruption that involved professional schemes of collecting and distributing money. A scheme to which were part public agents, private agents, state-owned companies, private companies, political parties, members of Congress, members of the executive. It's impossible not to be ashamed of what happened in Brazil. Although I think we should be proud. Probably no country in the world has had the courage of exposing a major problem like this and trying to fight it in daylight like we are doing right now. But what we realize is that corruption, as I said, was not the product of individual failures. It was the product, as I see it, of an oligarchic pact that was celebrated by part of the political class, part of the business class, and part of the state bureaucracy. A pact to plunder the state, to loot the state, and distribute privately public monies that were deviated. This is what happened in Brazil. What's new in Brazil is the reaction of the civil society. People not accepting anymore what was, of course, unacceptable. And I think this reaction by society has fostered a change of attitude in the institutions, a change in the legislation, and a change in the case law. And with cases like the mensalão, I know that first they had tried with the Banestado case, it didn't work. The mensalão worked better, and then the car wash operation, and then I think we are starting to change the country. But my perception is civil society is pushing the institutions, and we need to correspond to these demands of society. So I think the changes are in course, but there is, as anyone can see, a major reaction against the changes that are being implemented. And there are people, there are the representatives of the old order that would like to keep things as they have always been. And they are very powerful. And they have allies everywhere, as you can imagine, in the high spheres of government, in all powers of government, in the press, and even where you would less expect. And it's an ongoing battle, I would say. And the old order has two main groups, I think, trying to keep things as they always were. The first lot is people that don't want to be punished for all the wrongdoings they've done for many years, because they were sure that law would never reach them. But there is a worse lot. There are the people that don't want to become honest, neither now nor ever. They just want to keep things as they are. And they are very powerful, and they still are everywhere around. I think the good thing I would say is I think the country has changed. the train has left the station or a seed has been planted, and I'm very convinced that nothing will be the same again in Brazil. What we should know, however, is that this is a fight that we win by points, not by knockout. So it takes time, it takes perseverance, but we should get going. I want to use here to end this topic and then conclude with an allegory I heard with the discussion with my good friend, Paulo Barroso, who is a law professor here in Boston and a political scientist. And the allegory he used, which I found very interesting, and I even wrote it down with my own words, but it's his idea, was basically the following. Suppose an individual that is addicted to drugs. He's very functional. He still can do his job and go on living. But the addiction is killing him. It's doing him a great harm. But nobody notices that. Nobody realizes he is a drug addicted. But one day, this individual realizes he's a drug addicted, and he decides to fight the addiction. Well, in the first moment, when he starts fighting the addiction, life becomes much worse because of the typical withdrawal syndrome that any addicted suffers when he goes to this process of detox. But that's the only way for him to get healed, to fight the addiction. Well, this is a good allegory of what's going on in Brazil. We got addicted to a way of doing business and doing politics that was very corrupt. And I think we are in the process of realizing the gravity of the problem and in the process of starting the detox, starting to get rid of the drug, which is corruption. So part of the crisis we're going through right now is kind of a withdrawal syndrome from corruption. We are learning with great difficulty to create a new threshold for doing business and doing politics in Brazil. The problem is the old has to leave and the new is still growing, but this is our role here, I think, to push history forward and make future come as soon as possible. I'm going to finish this talk with a reflection based on a book that I read recently, which is a great book, and it helps to understand Brazil, called Why Nations Fail, by two professors here from Boston, actually. They're on Semoglu and James Robinson. I think Robinson left recently. The central thesis of the book is, the book tries to explain why countries reach prosperity or they become poor. And the main argument is that countries that became rich are the ones that were able to create economic and political institutions that were inclusive. And the countries that became poor are the ones that were conducted by extractive elites that did not allow for inclusive economic and political institutions to grow. Applying these ideas to Brazil, although I think we made a lot of progress, we have not yet changed the main structural causes of corruption in Brazil, which I think are the political system and a state, a public sector that is too big, too inefficient, and that can distribute favors very broadly. And that's one problem. So we should not think that we are going to change Brazil with criminal law and punishments. That's part of the process, for sure. But we need to fight the structural causes of the corruption, and these are two of them, besides, of course, investing in education and other areas. So I think the process of creating inclusive institution in Brazil is very important to have this in mind. And I think we are living to use an expression of the same authors, a critical juncture, a conjuntura crítica. And at this point, we have this horrible ethical, economic, and political storm in Brazil. But this is the environment that creates the conditions to change the institutions and try to create inclusive economic and political institutions. I need to close because my time is over. What I want to say, as we celebrate 30 years of democracy, we have several achievements to actually celebrate, and I don't think we should disconsider this. We should not focus only in the devastating snapshot of the moment. We should look to the history of these 30 years of democracy. And these 30 years of democracy can give us some reassurance that the next 30 years will be as successful as the past 30 years generally, I think, have been. I think we are on the verge of a profound and peaceful revolution in Brazil, which is changing the threshold, the paradigm of public ethics and private ethics in Brazil. I think this is the task of our generation. This is the last task of our generation. We won the dictatorship. We won hyperinflation. We had important victories against extreme poverty. Now we have this important final battle, and then we're going to leave path for the next generation, which is raising the threshold of ethics in Brazil, starting with giving good examples. In a recently event that I went to talk, a student leader greeted me saying, Justice, Professor, I don't want to live in a different country. I want to live in a different Brazil. I thought that was a great quote, and I end with it. Thanks.
Thank you, Justice Barroso, for this insightful and optimistic account of the tough moments we're living in. I feel we need some optimism. Before starting our Q&A session, Professor Pande will make a comment on Justice Barroso's lecture.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I wanted to pick up on one theme that came up at the end, which was to talk about how do you build inclusive institutions. And I wanted to link that back to what I had been talking about, and to more broadly to how social scientists and economists would think about this question. And just as background, I think one way you could read the Acemoglu and Robinson book is actually quite a pessimistic book. It's a book that says that if you don't end up making the right choice at the right time, so when you hit this critical juncture, if you don't have the lucky accident of, say, the Glorious Revolution in the United Kingdom, well, then you may end up with the extractive elite, continuing to make a country not work well. I wanted to juxtapose it against what a number of people think about, is to say, well, if we think that people want to do what's good for them, how do you align their incentives? How do you get them to do the right thing? A different way of saying it is that perhaps everyone is capable of being corrupt, but in some places being corrupt is too expensive an activity, which is why they're not corrupt. So how do you take a country and make it one where corruption becomes not worth your while? It becomes too expensive an activity to do. The personal cost is too high. How do you take a country and make it one where actually investing in redistribution is the thing that is appropriate, that is actually something that you think is going to be the best thing, even if you only care about yourself? And so one way we think about it is we want to align incentives of different players, especially in systems where there's delegated governance, but we recognize that this is hard. And I think this is where information becomes very important. Information allows you to monitor, it allows you to have transparency. So as many of you are thinking about what is it going to take to build inclusive institutions, I would say the insight that economists working on corruption would offer is to say there are really two policy levers that are critical. The first is incentives. So think about ways in which you align incentives. How do you set up penalty systems for, say, corrupt activities? How do you decide who gets promoted for being possibly, telling the truth, for being a whistleblower? And then the second is, what kind of investments in information and transparency can you make? I gave you one example, which was the audits of Brazilian municipalities. There are many other examples one can think of, but I think as one thinks of putting in place inclusive institutions, everyone needs sort of specific steps of what to do. Otherwise, it's easy to be pessimistic about the process. And I think to think about really aligning incentives and improving information are two key insights that we see again and again across different parts of the world.
Thank you. We'll start our Q&A session. I think we don't have much time, but we'll start with a few questions for Justice Barroso. So I will pose, I think, 2 questions here, and then you can choose how to answer them. So our audience is interested in this corruption problem in Brazil, and they ask if we can blame our constitution for the deeply ingrained corruption in the country. They are also worried about the moment we're living in, and they ask you if you think there is some military threat in Brazil today. And also, they wonder how can we, as a society, be part of this fight against corruption.
First thing I want to comment and thank Professor Pan for being here. I was so focused on what I was going to say that I didn't actually interact. And the other thing, Professor, when you speak in a foreign language, you kind of lose a lot of the rhetoric tools that you have in your own language. So when this happens, you better have some ideas or you are in trouble. So I was trying to focus on my own ideas, but it's a great pleasure and an honor to be in this panel with you. I don't share this view. I think the book that we're talking about, we're both talking about the Why Nations Fail. I think the message is you can always turn to the right direction anytime you want. So I don't think there is a historical determinism. I think history is not a fate that you accomplish. It's a history that you write. So we're trying to rewrite history in Brazil, and hopefully we will be able to. I don't think we should blame the Constitution, and probably we shouldn't look for one guilty object or one guilty person. We have a history in Brazil of from the beginning of patrimonialism, of private appropriation. That was very Iberian in the system in which the money that belonged to the kingdom was not separated from the money that belonged to the king. So the mixture between private and public in Brazil's history comes from the beginning of the colonization. This state that is top-bottom and not bottom-up has always been there And it's very difficult to switch this balance. And I think that we've always had a culture of inequality. That there are people that are superior and people that are inferior, that there are people that are subject to the law and that there are people that are above the law. So we are fighting quite a few of these functions that have been there for many decades, for many centuries, probably since the beginning. So it's not an easy task. So I wouldn't blame the Constitution. Definitely I wouldn't. I don't fear a military threat. I most definitely don't. I don't think, and I think we should say something good about the military in Brazil. And the person that's talking to you right now was a militant against the military regime before the redemocratization. I strongly opposed it in many ways. But if there is one part of Brazil that didn't give any trouble in the past 30 years, that was the military. Exemplar behavior. And there's no reason why we should fear that. They have paid the very high price of being in power for such a long time. And I doubt that they would like to go through that again. We learned our lessons. What you can feel is that the military, like everyone else in Brazil, they are concerned, they want to change things for the better, and so do I, and so does everyone here. But there's no risk whatsoever, I would say, of a military coup or anything of that sort. We've learned our lesson. They've learned their lesson. And what we need to do, and we all want to do, is to improve the quality of politics. That's the way. In a democracy, politics is essential. The world and Brazil have tried the other options. Military dictatorships, technocrats, the political police, or religious fundamentalisms. There is no alternative better than democracy. So we need to cope with what we have and try to improve it. So my answer is definitely no. This is a ghost that I think we are rid of. How society can change. Professor Pant, are you originally, your family from India?
That's right.
Okay. I would cite Gandhi here. Start with yourself. Definitely. That's where changes start. So play your part the best you can. I think that's the first thing I could say. And starting from oneself, I think we can try to have governments that are more accountable, more responsive. But institutions are made of people. If people don't behave well, there's no way institutions can work well. If this is the end of my talk, I want to use one last paragraph because I think it's very important in a moment like this. Brazil only really started in 1808 when the royal family came to Brazil, fleeing from a Europe that was at Napoleon's mercy, Professor Pant. Before that, the ports were closed, so we could not have trade with other nations. There were no roads, it was prohibited. There was no manufacturers, it was prohibited. There was no money, no currency, so things were done by scambo. I knew that word in English, but I forgot. And 1/3 of the population were slaves. And there was no school. 98% 98% of the population in Brazil were illiterate. So this was the infrastructure in Brazil 210 years ago. Now let's take a look at the superstructure. We were not heirs of the Anglo-Saxon tradition that had the Magna Carta since 1215. We were the heirs, very dear as our Portuguese friends are, we were heirs of the last country in Europe to end Inquisition. Last country in Europe to abolish slave trade. Last country in Europe to phase out absolutism. So with that infrastructure and with this superstructure, in 200 years, Brazil became one of the largest mass democracies in the world and one of the 10 largest economies in the world. We were probably one of the most successful countries of the 20th century. We multiplied income over 15 times. So, again, we look at the picture, it's devastating. But if we look at history, we've come a long, long way. And we have many reasons to celebrate and many reasons to be proud. Not to be satisfied, but to be proud of what we have achieved and move on and try to do new and good things. And we can't wait for things to be perfect so that we are going to start doing right things. I read these days one poster that said, life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. Life is about learning to dance in the rain. So we got to keep going. And I think the most important message, and again answering one of the questions is that no matter what's happening around you, play your part the best you can.
Thank you. So we have one last question to Professor Pande. So the audience asks, how do we conciliate the need to have evidence-based policy and the democratic channels of policymaking?
It's interesting. I actually don't think of them as something that needs conciliation, but I think that evidence-based policy making is often some of the best ways of ensuring that you have democratic policy making. So just to give you a couple of examples, it's very easy to say we want to put in place policies to fight corruption. It's very easy to put in place policies that actually have no effect on corruption. So I have a colleague who describes this often as isomorphic mimicry. And the example he gives is often of Uganda. So if you look on the paper, so you look at sort of de jure policies, everything looks perfect. You have every policy in place. You have the anti-corruption office. You have the regulator office. But then you ask, what does it achieve? And it's very little. And the only way you're going to actually realize that whether these policies that are supposed to provide democratic voice are actually doing it or whether they've been captured is by having information and evidence on them. So that's one answer about implementation. The other side of it is when you, we assume very easily that giving citizens electoral power gives them information. That's not true. Very often you'll have elected politicians or policymakers who have access to a lot of discretionary funds. Again, I'd go back to the audit reports of Brazilian municipalities as a classic example. The average citizen didn't know how the money was being spent. They were supposed to elect and re-elect mayors on the basis of their performance, but they had very little information of what their actual performance was. And again, this is a place where bringing out information, bringing out data is a way of enabling electoral accountability to work much better. So I think both in terms of designing policies that actually work, but also giving citizens the information so that they can use one of the most important tools they have, which is their vote effectively. I think both require a lot more investment in evidence-based policy making. And again, I think the judiciary can play a key role in pushing different branches of the government to be engaging in it.
Thank you, Professor. Please join me in thanking our panelists.